Okay, all right. Well, let's pray. The Lord be with you. Let's pray all together. Almighty and everlasting God, who hast given unto us thy servants grace, by the confession of a true faith, to acknowledge the glory of the eternal Trinity, and in the power of the divine majesty to worship the unity. We beseech thee that thou wouldest keep us steadfast in this faith, and evermore defend us from all adversities, who livest and reignest one God, world without end. Amen. All right, well, we'll be reading this collect every week as a reminder, because, one, I think it contextualizes the Trinity, that the Trinity is not a kind of data point that we kind of adhere to, but rather it is evidence of you have to have faith to confess the Trinity. To know God rightly, you have to trust who he is, because the Trinity does not on its own make sense. God is three persons, one God, and what we'll see today when we look at Christian heresies is heresies are typically people trying to make sense out of this doctrine, which cannot be brought down to human reason. Now we can; it's rational. It's not like it's God is saying like something totally ridiculous. It is reasonable, but it cannot be kind of captured by a reason. And heresies typically are places where sometimes well-meaning, sometimes not well-meaning. People in the history of the church sought to kind of round out the edges, to kind of help God out by simplifying the Trinity a little bit. God, this whole Trinity thing, that's not really a good seller. Let me help you. And it didn't go well. So last week we talked about all of the political background. You had West and East. You had all these things, but they were all leading. And one of the things I kind of want to point out is it's very fascinating to me that at the point of the Council of Nicaea, you have kind of three major streams, in a sense, coming together. You have the political stream of the Roman Empire actually becoming a Christian nation, which is wild. I mean, if you had told Christians in the first century, someday Caesar, the Roman emperor, would be baptized and be a Christian, they would have said,
no way.
There's that. You mean the guy who is trying to murder all of us? And it's like, yeah, but that guy. And if you told them that someday the whole Roman Empire, Rome that killed Jesus, would be a Christian country in a sense. In fact, their shields would have Christ's name on them. It would have boggled the mind. And so you have these things moving where the political kind of sphere is catching up. You have this philosophical movement that's been happening for hundreds of years in the kind of Greco-Roman world that is talking about these concepts that we're going to talk about today, that is beginning to kind of get close to what the church will begin to grab hold of to try to understand the Trinity. And then you have this Jewish and scriptural background of this kind of witness to who God is in Christ. And all of them are kind of converging, and all of them are kind of growing and developing towards this point. And you couldn't really have the Council of Nicaea without one of those movements. You need all three of them to come together for this thing to happen. And that's why we believe that God is kind of providentially organizing history for this to take place. So we talked about the massive mess that all this was, but it ended with Constantine defeating Maxentius in the battle of what? Anybody remember? The bridge, the Milvian Bridge.
It begins with an M.
It does. And right before the battle, this is a painting by Raphael. It's in the Vatican, I think. I think when you walk into the Vatican, there's a big Constantine room. That he before the battle, looked up and he saw a cross. Now, Constantine told Eusebius, who is the church historian who's recording a lot of this stuff, and he'll be a player in the Council of Nicaea that we'll see in a couple weeks. He told him that not only did I see it, but all my soldiers saw it, which is fascinating because that's an easily refutable statement. All you need is soldiers going, he didn't really see it. So, most likely, Constantine saw something. The kind of most credible thing that I saw was it might have been there's something that can happen during that season of the year around noon, where I can't remember what it's called now, but basically the way that the sun hits with light and all this stuff, it kind of forms this kind of like visual cross that he looked up and he saw that, but he had been hearing about Christians. Now, Constantinius, his father, during the Diocletian persecution, Constantinius never really persecuted Christians that much. He didn't really have the stomach for it. I think he burned a couple churches just to make Diocletian happy, but he really wasn't all that into it as Diocletian was. And there was something about it that he respected. I think Constantine got that from his father, and so at some point he sees this cross and he has this vision of under this name, in what was it in Latin?
In this sign.
In this sign.
In hoc signo vinces.
In hoc signo vinces. In this sign you will have victory. And so he puts. This is another picture of him. Behold, the X is the Greek letter for key, and the P is actually the Greek letter for R, rho, Cairo, and those are the first letters of what? Christ. All right. So that symbol, you might have seen that symbol before. They put that on all their shields. And they went out and they fought the battle of Milvian Bridge and they conquered Maxentius. And one of the things we talked about last week was multiple guys during this whole Roman tetrarchy kind of palace intrigue thing would begin to see themselves as in some ways divinely appointed. And that would give them a lot of courage to do things and sometimes courage to do stupid things, like Maxentius leaving the gates of Rome to go fight Constantine. And Constantine being like, are you really? Did you just do that? And killing him. But Constantine truly does believe himself to be there have been multiple theories. Again, this book is, not only is it interesting content, very well written. Peter Leithart, Defending Constantine, The Twilight of an Empire and the Dawn of Christendom. If you've ever had a negative view, and now Constantine, as all figures of history, is complicated. But there are some who have said that Constantine was just a Machiavellian. He saw Christianity as a means to an end. And so he became a Christian so that he could... But there really wasn't much advantage to being a Christian. It wasn't like Christianity was, just the whole... It was just spreading, and it was like this voting block that if all of a sudden you switched and you were like, by the way, I'm a Christian, you didn't even need a voting block. He was the emperor. That Constantine, for all intents and purposes, truly did become a Christian in the sense of he really did begin to see him being divinely appointed for a task by God and Jesus Christ. Come on in, Cindy. And so what he did was right after this battle in the Edict of Milan, basically creates creates a sense of peace for Christians in the empire. Now, one of the things he doesn't do is make it. People expected back in those days, if you were switching religions and you were the emperor, you could do that and say, by the way, now we're all Christians and no more pagans. All the stuff that you were doing, get rid of it all. He didn't do that. Constantine actually is one of the first examples we have in history of a kind of secular nation, not secular as in well, we're not Christian, but trying to create a religiously neutral playing field where religion would be done by persuasion rather than at the point of a sword. Constantine normally gets accused of, he's like the Crusades, converting everyone at the point of the sword. Actually, no, he was saying pagans can continue to be pagans. We are going to be Christians in Rome, and so he built a lot of churches. He did a lot to encourage things, and he protected Christians. Edict of Milan basically said everyone can worship the way that they need to worship. Now, that wasn't necessarily, you'll see, he does see himself as a role in protecting the church from heresy. But he allowed pagan religions to continue on and didn't persecute them. Then 10 years later, he defeats Licinius, the guy over in the east, and it becomes one holy Roman Empire. And so Constantine believes that God has actually appointed him in some ways to help lead and protect and govern the church. And he doesn't see it as like he's some pope that can dictate everything, but he does see that he has a role to play, and he takes responsibility for that. Right after 313, the Donatist controversy breaks out. The Donatist controversy would be its own class, but basically during the Diocletian persecutions, you have two things that happen. You have some Christians who don't give in and are willing to be martyred and killed. Sometimes killed, sometimes tortured, sometimes losing property, losing their status in governance and in society. And then you have other Christians who gave in and didn't lose those things and renounced. Well, then what do you do after this is over when those Christians who renounce come back to the church and say, I said I renounced because I didn't want to be tortured to death. But I do believe this, and I still want to be a part of this. Well, the Donatists were a movement of people who basically said, you can't come back. And it started in northern Africa, and they basically said, particularly there were some bishops who had turned over sacred writings to the Romans during the persecution, and the Donatists started calling them traitors, traditores. And they said that anyone who is baptized by this bishop, anyone under this bishop, their Eucharist is not valid under them. They're not welcome in the church. And you can understand the tension of, we paid for this with our own blood. We have friends who died. You got off scot-free. Who says you get to come back? And this problem will actually be a problem for the next couple centuries, and it's really Augustine who really takes this thing head on, and actually through this reminds people of this strange Christian idea that had been lost of grace, that we do actually welcome even traitors back into our midst. Who was it that denied Jesus? Judas and Peter. And what did Jesus do with Peter? Restored him. Do you love me? Do you love me? But during that, early on, Constantine saw this was happening. The people being persecuted by the Donatists reached out to Constantine. The Catholic Church, as in the Universal Church, they renounced the Donatists as being the separatists, as the people saying you can't come back in. And Constantine actually agreed with them. So he calls two councils. So this is early. This is even 10 years before, beginning to see Constantine, how he's trying to govern, him calling councils of the church together to discuss a controversy. The councils of Rome and Arles, they both basically condemn the Donatists, and he sides with the Catholic Church, and he persecutes the Donatists. And then it's interesting, in 321 he realizes the persecution's not really working. That just like it didn't work before, that is not the way to convince people that they're wrong. In fact, usually it does the opposite. It convinces people we're right, and that's why they're attacking us. So he relents on persecution, but he remains with the Catholics, again, the Universal Church. All right, and then to kind of put a pause on Constantine, he hears about a new controversy breaking out in Alexandria that is spreading across the empire, and calls another council, this time with the whole church, to deal with it. And that's how Constantine ended up at the Council of Nicaea. Okay, now,
Can I ask
yeah.
a question? So in 300 years, Christianity had spread completely around the Mediterranean rim
Yeah.
or completely throughout the Roman Empire? And in 300
Throughout the whole Roman Empire, yeah. I mean, Constantine, you had people up in England, and especially once you have the Holy Roman Empire, but Rome's roads and travel system, you have another thing happening that's really interesting at the birth of Christianity, where these things are kind of lining up of Alexander the Great conquering the whole world and Hellenization, where he spread, instead of allowing different cultures to exist as their own culture, Alexander the Great was more like, we're just going to add Greek to everything, and so he kind of merged in Greek world with everything. Well, what that did was it created one common language that the whole world basically spoke, which was Greek. And then Rome connected the whole world with safety and infrastructure. So when Christianity spreads, it's got a universal language that almost everybody can speak and easy access and travel. And so it really is, it happens at the perfect time in history for this to occur, for it to spread wildfire. If it happened before then, it might have spread, but you couldn't travel like they would have needed to travel. It was unsafe to travel like that. If it happened, later, well, somebody else might have done it. But, okay, a couple philosophical backgrounds. I'll have to move through this pretty quick. You have, in Judaism, right at the time, kind of leading up to this, you really do get two major cultural centers forming in Judaism, Antioch and Alexandria. These two cities play a big role in early Christianity. Just so you guys can see what we're talking about, Antioch is over here in modern-day Syria, like right there. And then down here is Alexandria. And both of those were highly intellectual, highly philosophical, and Judaism had really, and kind of two different forms of Judaism. Alexandria was fascinated with the synthesis with Greek thought. A lot of Jewish and Greek thought were kind of coming together. They were talking about concepts like logos. Remember in John 1 it says, and the word, the logos, was with God, and the word was God. Spirit, hypostasis, which is a word that will come into play. A lot of these words that eventually come into the Council of Nicaea were actually already being discussed in Jewish kind of thought and in philosophical thought. So in Greco-Roman thought, you had a couple major players. I'm really bad at philosophy, so this is a bad philosophy lesson on philosophers. Okay, so you got two major ones that we'll talk about. You have some other ones that did have an impact, but we don't have time to get into them. One is Plato. Plato is famous for his cave analogy, if you've ever heard of Plato's cave. But he was all about dualism, this kind of sharp distinction from matter and form. And what Greek philosophers were always trying to do is figure out, like, what's real? Like, what can you really count on? And one of the first starting places was nothing. You can't count on anything tangible because everything is constantly in flux. You can't step in the same river twice. You can't. How do you know that anything is going to continue on the way it is? You really can't trust anything in this world. And what Plato said was, but you can still have knowledge of things. But that knowledge of things is knowledge of another world. And so Plato separated this world from the world of forms. And the world of forms is inaccessible to us. We can't see the world of forms. But our souls are originally part of the world of forms, which we can, through remembrance, we can kind of get back up there. Through our reason and our intellect, we can get back up there. The only thing that is real is the world of forms. Everything else is a shadow or a copy of that. All right. So what I'm talking about is how do you know what something is? And what they said was, well, everything kind of corresponds to these eternal forms that are elsewhere, that then down here they end up little copies of. So for instance, if you walked in and you saw this, what would you say this is?
Lectern.
A lectern. Now what if it had been a different looking lectern?
Podium.
You know, you would have still said it's a lectern. In fact, I could have like 8 different, or for instance, what is this right here? All right, what is it that Tim's sitting on? But do they look the same? No.
Same function.
Same function, same form. For Plato, it was, okay, this is just it's a shadow, it's a copy of, but there is something that human beings know. You could show, and you didn't have to, and this is why, I mean, Plato isn't stupid. What he's saying is, I know it sounds really weird, but what he's saying actually makes a lot of sense in the sense of when you were teaching your children how to speak, you did not have to show them a picture of every chair that had ever been invented. Rather, you told them basically one chair. That's a chair. And what did they do?
They extrapolate.
They just knew, from now on, I know every single thing is a chair. Okay? So the Greek philosophers were like, why? How is it that you can do that? How do you know what a chair is, despite the fact that you haven't seen every single chair? How do you know what a plant is, despite the fact that you haven't seen every single plant? And that's why they would say, okay, there's something up there that's like chairiness that we in some ways can kind of tap up into. Now, for Plato, God, whatever he was the ultimate form, and he was the demiurge, or the kind of something from him was emanating. They were also fascinated by motion. Why are things in motion? How do things get in motion? And so what they kind of, when you start small and you kind of build, what they kind of said was, well, logically, there has to be something that is creating motion that is not being moved, right? Because if you keep wandering back up the scale of what that motion is, at some point there has to be something that is not being moved that is moving, and that thing can't be a two-way street, because anything that thing has to be kind of untouchable, because anything that touches it is a form of movement on it, is an influence on it. It has to be something that is so out there that it only is giving or emanating, and nothing is emanating it. And this is what they got into, the idea that, well, whatever that God is way up there, you can't know him for sure, because any knowledge we would have of him would be some type of impact on him, some type of way of touching him, of way of influencing him. So you can't know him, but we can probably know that he's there, and from him is coming all things. And so the ultimate divine being is unknowable. And so what Plato said was, well, then he's got to have like lesser beings that are the things that are actually creating. And particularly for Greeks, that God, whatever's way up there, could never create matter, because matter's so gross and so base. He has to be so far removed from the actual creation of things. And so what Plato did, and then what guys in Plato's kind of line did, was they began to kind of extrapolate, well, there's got to be all of these intermediary beings that are creating and emanating out matter and material, the material world. But it can't be that thing up at the very top. And so Plato typically has a very low view of, golly, I got to change that next week. Very low view of the material world. Okay, Aristotle, we won't spend a lot of time on him. He's probably the best of all of them. But Aristotle got much closer to accepting the material world as real. He divided things up into categories. One of them being substance. The Greek word for that is ousia. That'll come into play big with the Council of Nicaea. Substance, like the thing in and of itself. Quantity, quality, relation, place, date, position, state, action, passivity. Aristotle was saying, okay, there is a chairiness about it, but that chairiness about it is not distinct from it way up in the world of forms. Rather, it exists within it. So he was a little bit more okay with the material world. There was something about this chair that possessed in and of itself chairiness. And so there's a famous painting of the School of Athens, and at the center is who? Anybody know? This is also Raphael in the same room, I think, with the Constantine ones.
Aristotle and Plato.
There you go. Very good. Aristotle and Aristotle and Plato. Plato here, where's he pointing? Up. It's all up there. That's where the real is. Reality's up there. And Aristotle is saying, no, it's here. There are things we can know here. Aristotle was Plato's student. Now, all that was hundreds of years before. But you get this sharp dualism between matter and spirit. Matter is always bad. It's always lesser. Spirit is always where the real stuff is. All right? And this idea that God, Aristotle had the same idea, the demiurge, a little bit different, but he called him the prime mover, that he is the thing that everything's emanating out from and nothing can get to him. Heresy. Now let's get into heresy. Heresy in the New Testament begins almost immediately. I'm going to go really quickly through this. Paul talks about heresy in the New Testament. If anyone preaches another gospel, let him be accursed. Fierce wolves will come in speaking twisted things. They will not endure sound teaching and wander off into myths. Peter. Now it's not working. Okay. Peter also, late in his life, was saying there will be false teachers among you, bringing in destructive heresies. 2 Peter 3:16. Paul's writings are scriptures, but some twist them to their own destruction. So now you have this idea that, yes, you have the scriptures, but there are people who are twisting them and leading people towards destruction. And then John also. Every spirit that confesses Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. Many deceivers have gone out who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. And then 1 John 2:22, who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? All three, there are examples early on in the New Testament of heresies happening in the church. So what are they? There are two main early Christian heresies, Docetism and Ebionism. All right? Docetism is the belief that Jesus wasn't fully man, he only appeared to be human. The Greek word for dokeo is to appear or to seem. And the idea is that Jesus was kind of floating God deity masking as a human being. Now, before we judge that too harshly, there's a long history of that in mythology and in religious world, of the gods coming down, the gods kind of putting on flesh as a disguise. Zeus would come down and, whatever he would do with some maiden, and he would wear, a skin suit, basically, for him to come down and impregnate an unsuspecting or maybe suspecting female. But in no way were they ever saying that Zeus was human. They were saying that Zeus appeared as a human for a time. And sure, he was physical, you could touch him, but he wasn't an actual human being. So early on, Docetism is this kind of Greek idea. Again, if the material world is bad, if the physical world is bad, then you could never imagine. Plato and Aristotle could never, ever imagine the divine being a human being. Because of the flesh, because of the material existence. The whole goal was to escape material existence and get up to whatever's out there, right? So the idea that God became human is impossible, and it's quite frankly embarrassing. Rooted, and ultimately it is rooted in a fear and an altogether understandable human attempt to avoid suffering. The idea that God would suffer is shocking to a Greek, especially, audience. The divine cannot suffer. Remember, it's all the way. It's way, way, way up there. Nothing can touch it. In fact, if the divine suffers, it is no longer the divine because what? Because something is moving it. something is affecting it, something is touching it when it should not be touched in order to be that prime mover. And so Docetism was rooted in a fear, an attempt to avoid suffering. It is very Platonic, matter is evil, and it really took root in Alexandria. C.F. Allison says, the docetic flight from suffering, so humanly understandable, nevertheless is a way of escape, not a way of the cross. For the Docetists, Jesus could not have actually died on the cross. And so what they even believed was that it wasn't actually Jesus that died on the cross. It was actually Simon of Cyrene, the guy that picks up his cross when he's on his way to the cross. They said there was a big mix-up, and Simon, they give Simon his cross, and Jesus kind of drifts off into the crowd, and Simon's like, wait, what? Where did the guy go? They're like, you're the guy now. And it's like, so that's what they literally taught. No, it wasn't Jesus that died on the cross. It was actually Simon, because God cannot die. He cannot suffer. So that was one of the early Christian heresies. The other one is the opposite, Ebionism.
It doesn't make sense, because the only reason Jesus could be God is because he did arise from the dead. So if he never died, then he couldn't arise from the dead, and he couldn't be God.
Well, they could have explained that by saying if Simon died, Jesus is still around. Boom, he shows up 3 days later.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus can't rise from the dead because God can't die.
Yeah.
No, they didn't believe. I mean, it's a heresy. Yeah. It's not true. But
Wait, you sure?
I do want us to, heresy typically, heretics don't come to the church and say, my goal is to destroy you and lead you astray. And that's what we think. Heresies had, black hats, and they looked mean, and they came in, they were like, I'm a heretic. And everyone's like, I don't want to follow you, but I guess so. No. They came in, they were trying to offer people things that they thought would be of help. You don't want to suffer. Let's just paint rosy, and part of what I want us to understand with this is this stuff is still around. This kind of avoidance of this kind of idea that Jesus kind of floated through the world, and you can too. The flight from suffering, which leads to really an avoidance of really living your life. You can be so spiritually obsessed with things that have you ever talked to somebody who is going through a really hard time and they just paint over it really quickly with Jesus, everything's good, Jesus is so good, and you're like, well, yeah, okay, but Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, you can be honest about what's actually happening in your life. There is something in us that wants to avoid suffering if we at all can, but also acknowledging we can't. So the second heresy, it was similar to it, or actually the opposite of it, Ebionism. It's also referred to as adoptionism. Jesus wasn't actually God. All right? So you have two. Jesus wasn't actually man. Jesus wasn't actually God. He was a man whom the Spirit of God descended upon during his baptism because, when God says, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, Ebionists read that as Jesus had done something to earn God's pleasure, and therefore God was rewarding him with sonship. Now you could understand that because, Jesus is perfect. And Jesus follows the law, and you have a lot of things that you can try to build into that. The idea, and so Jesus really becomes, C.F. Allison says that Ebionism is the Roger Bannister of heresies. Anybody remember who Roger Bannister is?
The miler.
Close to the Hulk. He's the first person who ran a sub 4 minute mile.
Yeah.
Now, before Roger Bannister, everyone thought it was not only just no one had done it. They literally, scientists, and who are never wrong, they were saying it is physically impossible for a human being to run a sub 4 minute mile. Then Roger Bannister runs a sub 4 minute mile, and then what happens?
Everybody did.
Tons of people run sub 4 minute mile. That he broke the barrier of our psychology, of our belief in ourselves, and once he did that, all of a sudden we could all go for it. Well, this is kind of saying Jesus followed the law and earned the thing so that now we can be,
So you can too.
so you can too. So Ebionism, the message of Ebionism ultimately is, try harder. Jesus did it. Why can't you? Now, I don't know if you've grown up in church I grew up, I've heard things very close to that. Jesus was without sin, you know?
Church of Christ. Yeah.
Jesus was without sin, so could you. You know? Jesus accomplished all these things. Try harder. Do more. Be better. Be like Jesus. What would Jesus do? All right? Now, I'm not saying I'm not saying anyone who wears that's an Ebionism, but you can easily see how some of these things can turn into Jesus as our great example who goes ahead of us and is rewarded with sonship. It is moralist. It is ultimately very self-centered. It kind of appeases our self-centeredness. Adoptionism makes of Christianity a religion of control rather than a religion of redemption and reduces morals to moralism. It appeals to, Docetism appealed to people's inner desire to not suffer. Who wouldn't, which we understand. Ebionism appealed to people's inner desire to have control. Because if Jesus could do it, I could too. Who does that put in the main center of everything? Me. I have control of this.
Is there a relationship of Saul to Paul in that?
I don't know. That's a good question. We'll come back. Let's talk about that next week. I want to try to get through the. What do you mean?
Well, Saul was transmogrified.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is always a sense. You can go. I like how Bishop Allison puts it there. It reduces morals to moralism. It's not like the other way is to get rid of morals. But it is to say, and it's not like the other way is to say, you have no role to play in anything. But you're not at the center. Or at least I hope you're not at the center. Because if I'm at the center, then woe to me. This got so bad, there was actually heretical. I know this is shocking to you that a bishop could be heretical. But in the early church, it's never happened again since. These are jokes. These are inner Episcopal jokes. Never in the history of bishops has there been a heretical bishop other than Paul of Samosata, bishop of Antioch. He was actually the bishop. So this Docetism really flourished in Alexandria. Ebionism flourished in Antioch. In fact, it got so bad that the bishop of Antioch was an Ebionite. And he was deposed and condemned in the Council of Antioch in 268. So these two heresies were kind of the two main Christian heresies, and they're going to be kind of in and throughout the rest of the heresies that we're going to talk about. The next one was Marcionism. You might have heard this one. Marcion was an early heretic in the 2nd century. He believed that he was extremely anti-Semitic, and that was really one of the things coloring his theology was this hatred for the Jews. Therefore, the God of the Jews, we want nothing to do with the God of the Jews. Now, there's a stubborn kind of insistency in Christianity that the God of the Jews is the God of Christ. And you cannot be, we aren't Jewish. There is a distinction of something new that has happened, but also you cannot get rid of this history. And people have tried. And Marcion was one of the first ones to do it. In fact, but you also understand where Marcion's coming from. If you've ever heard the idea, well, that's the God of the Old Testament.
Yes.
I mean, that is a common thing that people say. God is angry, God is just, that's the God of the Old Testament. You got to read the God of the New Testament. That's a heresy. That's called Marcionism. He was so clear on this. Old Testament was this creator God. Again, going back to Plato, God, the ultimate God, could not create matter. Therefore, it had to be one of these lesser beings that he called the Old Testament God. Was the creator God. He was a lesser God than the ultimate God. He's mean. He's evil. And then in the New Testament, you get the real revelation of the true God, the ultimate God, who is spirit, heavenly, and he sends Christ. He's the greater God. Jesus is divine, but not human. So Marcion was docetic. Jesus is divine, but flesh and material world is evil. And he was declared a heretic. Gnosticism was another common heresy. This is also docetic. This was a kind of perennial villain. If Christianity was like a serial, Gnostics would be the people that keep coming back, and because even John is dealing with proto-Gnostics in the early church. When he's saying anyone who denies that Jesus came in the flesh, he's dealing with early Docetists and Gnostics. Gnosticism was, a lot of people point to Simon Magus in Acts 8, verses 18 through 19 as like the first example of this. When Simon saw that the Spirit was given at the laying of hands on the apostle, at the laying on of the apostles' hands, he offered them money and said, "Give me also this ability, so that everyone on whom I may lay hands may receive the Holy Spirit." Gnostics believed that Gnostics were a kind of mix of the kind of these mystery religions that we didn't really get to talk about, and this very, very Greek material world is bad, and everything kind of this elitist. Everything is only for those who really are in the know, and you're saved by special knowledge that only elites have, and they only give it out. Like Scientology is a great example of a highly Gnostic religion. You only get in, to really get what the good stuff. You got to get in. We have the secret stuff, and you got to work your way all the way up. And when you work your way all the way up, we'll give you more and more information. Christianity is the opposite. We tell you everything up front. There is no secret creed. The more you're into Christianity, the Nicene Creed is like what we say. It's like out in front. There is nothing beyond that. There's nothing deeper than that. I mean, there's ways to go deeper into that, but it's not like you get back into the back room of Holy Cross and we're like, well, here's our real creed. And so salvation is by knowledge. There is, again, a distance between creator and creation. Greater beings and lesser beings called aeons. They have this whole, what they created was hilarious. It's massive of all of these gods and all these things happening, and they just kind of used Christianity as a skin to kind of, but it had nothing to do with Christianity. But again, highly dualistic, body versus spirit. Irenaeus was the bishop of Lyon, and he fought the Marcionists and the Gnostics. Irenaeus, he was the 2nd century. His teacher was Polycarp, whose teacher was John. So he's only 2 generations away from the apostles. And Irenaeus was a hero of the faith, and he one of his major things in his writings, he wrote a book called Against the Heresies. This is back when they had really good book titles that told you this book is against heresies. And he fought Marcionism, Gnosticism, and one of his big things was creation is fallen. It is not evil in and of itself. Yes, it's fallen in sin. It's problematic. There's issues that we have to deal with. But material world is not evil. And he said, God the Father, increate, unengendered. That doesn't have anything to do with gender. It means not created he's the prime mover. Nothing is generating him. Invisible, one and only deity, creator of the universe. Merging Father Almighty, creator of the universe. This is something that Greeks would never have done. But this is what he believed the scriptures taught. So he fought them. Then you had a heresy called modalism or Sabellianism. Sabellius was a native of Libya. And his teaching was very popular in Libya, which will come up again. He came to Rome and befriended a bishop named Callistus, who then condemned him, but only to distract the fact that he agreed with him. I'm not a Sabellianist. Look, I condemn Sabellian. And then he taught Sabellianism. It was a little political betrayal and cover. But he taught that the Father and the Son are the same thing, just different hats, different masks. So Sabellianism stressed God's unity. God is one. And therefore the Father is the Son, and the Son is the Father, and the Son is the whole, that these two are one thing, not even different persons. One thing, and therefore, it's just a different way that he shows up in different scenarios. When God wants to be mad, he puts on the father cap. I'm the Father from the old, and then when he wants to be nice, he puts on the sun cap, and then when he wants to be weird, he puts on the Holy Spirit. And it's always kind of God floating around in different oneness Pentecostals are modalist. Every Trinitarian analogy is almost always going to be, if you've ever heard like analogies for the Trinity being like water, well, water is liquid, vapor, and solid. Yeah, that's modalism. That's a heresy. That's not, because if water is vapor, it's not what?
Either of the other two.
Either the other two. It can only be one thing at one time. It can't be all three at the same time, distinct, separate, but also one thing, right?
It's always H2O.
Right, but it's saying that the H2O appears sometimes as
Ice cube.
liquid,
Yeah.
then sometimes as solid. Pastorally, why this would be a problem is you can never depend on God to be one thing. How do you know that God is merciful? How do you know that God loves sinners? What if that's just a hat he's wearing right now? By the way, today I decided to be the Son and be kind. Tomorrow I'm going back to the Father, and it's not going to be good. Rather than the Son being an eternal person in the Trinity, an eternal reminder of God's mercy and grace and love towards sinners. There is no three, only one. So Sabellianism, it was fought by a guy named Tertullian. Tertullian is a fun guy because he was very mean at times. But he fought the modalists and the Sabellians. He called the bishop Callistus, the bishop of Rome. He would, in his writings, refer to him. He called him names. He called him busybody, which I think is funny. And he began to articulate this distinction between the Father and the Son, and he began to use terms like substance and person. That was the first. Those are words that aren't in the Bible. And I'm giving you all this background because those will all come into play during the Council of Nicaea, where they're going to reach back and they're going to go, yeah, these words that Tertullian was using, those are the words that we're looking at. All right. Sabellianism had a profound impact on Alexandria. It was fought also in Alexandria, especially by Origen. Origen stressed the diversity within God, but to the point of, at times, subordinating the Son. So Origen is kind of a mixed bag. He doesn't like Sabellianism because he thinks it's a heresy. So what he begins to teach is the idea, no, the Father and the Son are distinct people, but also he begins to go a little bit over here to where he's saying they're separate. And the Son is really a little bit lesser than the Father. The Son is subordinated to the Father, which will lead to what we'll look at next week, which is the rise of Arius. All right, so next week is when we're actually finally catching up.
Those are all.
So these are all heretics. Origen he's a mixed bag. He's fighting heresy. He has a lot of orthodox things. He said a lot of things that were really helpful to the church later, but he goes too far. And a lot of what happens in the Council of Nicaea is they're trying to find, everyone who's trying to fight these heresies as they show up is fighting them without being sure exactly how to. It's like when you know something's wrong, you're just not sure how to describe it yet. That's been the history of the church. They know every time there's a heresy, they know it's heretical. There's never a point where the heresy takes over. It's like, oh, well, everyone was modalist. No. Modalism began to teach, and everyone knew this is not true. How do we explain it? How do we say that why this is not true? And so the Council of Nicaea is really where all these heresies are leading to say, for them the church to finally get together and say, this is how we're explaining this, to try to make sense out of all of these false teachings. Including Arius, who's going to show up next week. That's where it really begins to grow. The heresy really begins to spread, and things get back. So I got to go. We got 1 minute till worship starts.